Look, I just want to know, will your love for me still be strong after the Game Boys of summer are gone? Hi there, I'm Joe, this is Same Name Different Game, and on this Labor Day weekend we are closing out the Game Boys of summer. Look, I'm gonna be honest with you here. If you're the type of person who complains when episodes are more about the history than the actual game itself, you might want to just skip this one. As you can see, I have retreated to the great indoors because I'm taking Corey's advice from the last episode and playing the Game Boy half of this episode on this guy right here. But before we get there, let's dive in with a little history about the changing video game landscape of 1995. I've made this argument before, but I'll re-up it here. 1995 is one of the most important years in video game history because it is the year that video games went from children's toys, a niche hobby, to mainstream entertainment all over the world. And how did that happen? With the worldwide launch of the Sony PlayStation. Now, I'm not going to get too into the PS1 here because I'm focused on the Game Boy this summer, but the PS1, which launched in Japan in December of 1994, moved more units than every home console of the previous generation combined. That's the Super NES, plus the Genesis, plus the Neo Geo, plus the TurboGrafx, plus more systems you might not have even heard of. Put their sales all together, and they still fall short of the PS1's worldwide numbers. Systems since then tend to shore that up. The PS2 moved even more units and remains the single best-selling console of all time. The generation after that, no single console broke that record, but between the Wii doing over 100 million units and the PS3 and Xbox 360 doing over 80 million each, the total home systems sold for that generation eclipsed every previous generation once again. 1995 was the beginning of gaming going truly mainstream, and the Game Boy was still there for it. But how did the Game Boy handle it? A system that was underpowered intentionally upon its release in 1989 seems like an unlikely candidate for continued success amidst a technological revolution that was changing the way we played games with polygon-driven 3D graphics. Believe it or not, the Game Boy was in pretty good shape in 1995. Sega's Game Gear was still in the fight, but the TurboGrafx was discontinued in North America in 1994, meaning there was no concern about the Turbo Express, and the Atari Lynx died a decidedly unceremonious death in 1995. Since Sony wouldn't offer a portable of their own for another decade, some studios ported games from the PS1 to the Game Boy. Yes, you heard me right. Some studios ported games from the PS1, a cutting-edge piece of gaming hardware from one of the premier electronics manufacturers in the world, to the humble Game Boy, a handheld system that, I must repeat, was intentionally underpowered for its release in the 1980s. And one of the games that did this was the game we're talking about this episode, Battle Arena Toshinden. So let's take a look at the PlayStation version. Battle Arena Toshinden for the PS1 is a game that appears to be largely forgotten today. and you can argue about whether that's appropriate or not. But what is hard to argue is that it is not a historically significant game. Toshinden on the PS1 was the first fully 3D fighting game made specifically for a console. It was also the first 3D weapons-based fighting game, beating Soul Edge from Namco by a few months. Released in 1995 in all territories, the game was developed by Tamsoft, who is now best known as the team behind the Senran Kagura series. But Toshinden was their very first credited game, and they got lucky, because while it was published in Japan by Takara, here in North America it was put out by Sony themselves, and centered in their ad campaigns, with Sophia as a sort of default mascot for the system. And that was a smart move, since the game got rave reviews from the press at the time. GamePro reviewed it as an import in their April 1995 issue, giving it a 4.5 out of 5. Game Players reviewed it in their first batch of PS1 game reviews in August of 1995 and gave it a 98%. The praise was effusive at the time. For my part, the first time I played Toshinden, I was completely blown away. I had a friend who imported a PS1 from Japan before they came out in the US, and the first time we popped this disc in, I am not kidding, I'd played Virtua Fighter in the arcade, but this was something else. This game looked better than Virtua Fighter, and we were playing it at home. But there's just one little problem. Battle Arena Toshinden has aged like so much soft cheese. Recently, some folks in certain vintage gaming circles say it isn't fair to old games to say they've aged poorly, but I think that's total nonsense. Great games feel timeless, and as I've just finished discussing, a game that has aged badly can still be historically significant. But the fact is, this game came out the same year Soul Edge hit arcades. One of them is still very playable, while the other is a painful slog. Toshinden on the PS1 broke some trends in arcade 3D fighters at the time, which tended to stick with more realistic fighting mechanics. Only bosses in Tekken games have projectile attacks. Virtua Fighter relies on effective combos. But Toshinden tries to marry Street Fighter II and Virtua Fighter in a lot of ways. Most of the 8 playable characters have a fireball type move. Many have attacks that send them across the entire playfield. It's just that now you can move up and down on the stages, and there are ring-outs. Sure, that's all pretty novel, as are the weapons, but the execution, especially playing today, feels wrong. There are special moves that leave you wide open to being punished even if they land. It's very hard to tell how close you need to be for an attack to hit. If an enemy gets behind you, attacking doesn't automatically turn you around to hit them as it does in many other 3D fighters. You can run, but you don't have running attacks. So if you do attack while running, you just stop dead in your tracks and do a standard move, instead of the impactful shoulder blocks or sliding tackles seen in games like Tekken. The biggest problem, honestly, is that the control feels bad. It's exceptionally hard to combo, and every reaction feels delayed, like the game is taking place in a swimming pool full of molasses. Because of this, special moves feel very hard to pull off, and the desperation moves seem to only happen on accident. But, you know, speaking of specials, at least there's a fart move for that one guy. It's really hard for me to recommend going back to Toshinden in 2019. It feels now like the kind of game someone would make you play in a random fighting game tournament like the ones I've played in at MagFest. And I know I didn't spend a ton of time talking about it, but I'm not the angry video game nerd, and I don't want to spend 10 minutes just coming up with different ways to say it sucks. So, let's move on to the Game Boy version. Before we dive in too hard on this, I'll say that yes, there are actually 2 other ports. The first one was to the Saturn, but that one does not have the same name, as it was called Toshinden S in Japan and Battle Arena Toshinden Remix in North America. The second was for the PC, and I just couldn't get it running. but it's my understanding that it's very similar to the PS1 version depending on how good your 3D accelerator was at the time. So that leaves us with the Game Boy port. Released in all territories in 1996, in Japan this game was known as Netto Toshinden, or Hot-Blooded Toshinden, which was a kind of sub-series Takara released on the Game Boy of simplified versions of mostly Neo Geo fighting games. From Netto King of Fighters to Netto World Heroes Jet to Netto Toshinden. But here in North America it was released as just Battle Arena Toshinden, and it's good? It was developed by B-Top, who you might remember as the folks behind the Genesis port of King of the Monsters 2 that was vastly different from the Neo Geo original and Super NES port. And they struck again. Clearly, the Game Boy was not equipped to handle any kind of 3D fighting game, so we get chibi fighters in a traditional sprite-based 2D fighting game. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Netto games from Takara inspired SNK, because a few years later, their own ports of fighters to their Neo Geo Pocket system looked and even played quite similarly, if not a bit more refined. As you can see, the game uses the Super Game Boy for some custom color stuff and a nice custom border. But what's not as obvious is the real reason I'm using the Super Game Boy. This game has a special mode called Jet Mode that can only be activated when played this way, because it borrows some of that sweet processing power from the Super NES, allowing the game to run faster than the default, which really makes it the optimal way to enjoy Toshinden on Game Boy. At its core, the game is very much a 2D-atized version of Toshinden. The whole standard cast is there, the moves are almost completely the same, and while you can't move in 3D, pressing both buttons allows you to dodge into the background to avoid attacks, a la certain SNK fighting games. You can even still ring out by pressing your opponent into the corner a certain number of times. The default is 3, but you can adjust it in the options. One of the biggest differences beyond the immediate visuals is that this game actually adds 2 hidden characters. While the PS1 game allows you to play as the 2 bosses, Gaia and Sho, with codes, this one adds Gaia's second incarnation as well as Uranus, both from Toshinden 2. Uranus serves as the final boss here, and all 4, Gaia, Gaia 2, Sho, and Uranus, are all playable with a code. This is gonna sound a little nutty, but it plays more smoothly than its PS1 counterpart, especially with Jet Mode turned on. And it's gonna feel a little weird, but let's go ahead and do like we always do, take a look and a listen side by side. For as poorly as it plays, Toshinden on the PS1 still looks great for an early 3D game, and the soundtrack is excellent. Meanwhile, the folks at B-Top did an admirable job of making big, recognizable, expressive sprites out of the source material, and moving that soundtrack onto Hip Tanaka's glorious portable sound chip. Both games look and sound excellent for the hardware they're on. And that makes it time to give the edge. And I'm as surprised as anyone, but it's the Game Boy version. I can't in good conscience recommend playing the PlayStation version unless you are on a retro gaming historical odyssey of your very own. If you're just looking for a fun fighting game to play, I'd look elsewhere. Maybe even at the Toshinden sequels. And that would normally be it. But this is the Game Boys of Summer, so I have lined up a very special guest to come and tell you about the legacy of Nintendo's handheld wonder. Someone whose entire online raison d'etre is to take you, dear viewer, through the highs and lows of the Game Boy library, one game at a time. Please welcome Mat, the Game Boyle.
30 years later, the legacy of the Game Boy is unquestionable. It started a portable gaming revolution that Nintendo was built on with various successors for the last 3 decades. Of course, culminating in the Big N's most recent console, the Nintendo Switch. The leap from Super Mario Land to Mario Odyssey is of course something to behold. But even more astounding is the leap from Link's Awakening to, well, Link's Awakening. Soon we'll be roaming around Koholint Island in search of musical instruments to wake the windfish once more. And while there have been some minor tweaks and upgrades here and there, the release of Link's Awakening will bring a monochromatic game into full colour. Well, not for the first time admittedly, but almost 3 decades on, the game will be introduced to a new audience. Just like Metroid Samus Returns did with Metroid 2 for the 3DS audiences a few years back. The reason Nintendo can remake and port these games to other platforms isn't a mystery. It's because at their core, the very best of the Game Boy library stand toe-to-toe with some of the greatest games of all time. That might sound a little hyperbolic, but I promise you, it's true. If you can get past the green hues and seeming simplicity of the console, there are games on the Game Boy that will honestly blow you away. Not with their flashy graphics, of course, but because thanks to the system's limitations, developers needed to focus on great game mechanics to make their titles unique. For every solid game like Super Mario Land 2 or Solar Striker, there's an experimental equivalent in Trip World and Zaz. For every great port like Penguin Wars and Soldam, there's one pushing the system's limitations like Donkey Kong 94. And lest we forget, if not for the Game Boy, would the world have fallen in love with Tetris, Kirby, or Pokemon? The Nintendo Game Boy is an institution. It's truly a system without which the world of gaming might be totally different from the one we know today. If you've not already had the pleasure of playing with portable power, then there's no better time to try it.
Thank you so much for stopping by, Mat. I really appreciate it. And if you, dear viewer, want to know more about the highs and lows of the Game Boy, make sure to check out Mat's YouTube. And that does it for this episode and for the Game Boys of Summer. But make sure to come back next time, because we will be getting rad. See you then. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, do all the stuff that everybody here asks you to do. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, blah blah blah. It really helps the channel. It really does help the channel. And if you really liked what you saw, please consider supporting the shows on Patreon. For just $1 per episode, you can get early access to new episodes and all kinds of other cool stuff. If you missed any installments of the Game Boys of Summer, the left has a link to the whole playlist, and the right is just going to be some older video that I haven't decided what it is yet. But click on it and watch it.